Hello and welcome to PressTV News Analysis. I'm Ph.D. Tarpley. As the Democratic National Convention got underway in Charlotte, North Carolina, America's national debt toppled a staggering $16 trillion. As the news came out, Republicans began pouncing. But who is to blame for this enormous debt? Democrats, Republicans, or both? Well, the fact is that the U.S. government, whether a Republican or a Democrat, has for the past decade spent money that it has not had. The incumbent Barack Obama has already spent more in 3.5 years of his term, over $5 trillion than George Bush Jr. did in 8 years. What does this mind-boggling debt mean for Americans? We'll be looking at the economic health of the U.S. and whether Americans are better off today than they were a decade ago.
Just 2 months before the presidential elections, and the two U.S. parties are campaigning for votes. Democrats are seeking to convince voters that President Barack Obama deserves another term in office. Their main obstacle is the faltering economy. Over 8%, or around 13 million of Americans, are out of work. Obama's speech is planned for Thursday, as he plans to capture the political spotlight with November's election looming.
President of the United States of America, Mitt Romney.
His Republican rival didn't get the expected boost in the opinion polls from last week's GOP convention. At the same time, a group of Occupy protesters marched towards the venue of the event. The protesters didn't have a permit, so they kept the protest mainly to the public sidewalks. Police arrested at least one protester, and the rally was broken up. As supporters of President Barack Obama shouted 4 more years outside the Democratic Party convention, the protesters shouted back, "No more years."
There has been a whole series of actions in the past days, again today and tomorrow and during the convention, called the March on Wall Street South. Charlotte, North Carolina is the finance corporate center, second only to Wall Street, and it is challenging the domination of the banks such as Bank of America, Wells Fargo, Duke Energy, with their control, really, which is only for the benefit of the 1%.
Another issue that could overshadow the convention is the record debt Obama has pocketed over the years.
Both political parties have completely abrogated their responsibility to maintaining a balanced budget. They want to have a large military, a large welfare state. They're unwilling to increase taxes, and I'm afraid that there's no sign of change, either with the Democrats or the Republicans.
The U.S. debt has risen to $16 trillion for the first time ever. The U.S. debt stood at $10.6 trillion when President Barack Obama first took office in 2009. This despite having promised to reduce it by half by the year 2012. The total outstanding U.S. public debt hit $16 trillion late Friday, yet the Treasury only officially announced the statistic on Tuesday. The deficit remains high because of a combination of factors, mainly high federal spending and low tax revenue. The total cost of the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan is estimated to run at least $3.7 trillion and could reach as high as $4.4 trillion.
The defense budget is one of the biggest things, in the whole budget statement. But when you have wars going on, they're expensive, and we still do.
The government is currently running an average monthly deficit of $100 billion. And is likely to hit the debt ceiling sometime in late December.
Big number there. Let's see what our guests think about this. Author and historian Webster Tarpley joins us from Washington. And we have Iraq war veteran Mike Preisner,
Hello,
who joins us from Los Angeles. Gentlemen, welcome. Webster Tarpley, first to you. Tell us what you think. The government has an official debt of $16 trillion as it's been announced, and it's mounting. This means, breaking it down, every man, woman, and child in America has about $51,000 share of this debt. It doesn't include the liability from Social Security and from Medicare. And of course, when you factor those in, it's been said that amounts to about $120 trillion or more. What is your impression of this? What does this mean for America's economy and its people?
Well, of course, the figures that you cite about Social Security and related entitlements are spread out over half a century, so these should not be seen as something you have to pay right now. The political party that's going to pay most attention to this debt situation are the reactionary Republicans and their candidate, the Wall Street asset stripper and hedge fund hyena, Mitt Romney, because they want to focus everybody on debt and deficits. I would say from the point of view of actual economics, this is not the main thing. We have a world economic depression. One of the symptoms is that the public debt is going up, but this is not the cause. And I wouldn't focus too much on that particular aspect of the crisis. The main problem for the whole economy and for the individual in this country is unemployment. The fact that we have about 30 million people who are either completely unemployed or underemployed or have given up in despair. The problem with the debt is simply that it seems to be bigger than it is because of the rest of the economy is so depressed. We've known since Alexander Hamilton that a funded public debt can actually be an advantage as long as it's not excessive. And the excessive means compared to the economy that you have. So the problem that we have is 4 years of stagnation. And the reason for this, of course, is that we've got too big to fail. We would need to have a recovery. In order to have a recovery, the traditional way this has been done is to have the banking system come up with credit, loans for plant, equipment, and new jobs, and they finance the recovery. The problem is we have zombie banks that are all bankrupt. They're all wards of the U.S. federal government. They've been judged too big to fail, which is illegal, but both parties agree on this. We've got the Wall Street puppet Obama, and we've got the hedge fund hyena Romney, and they both agree that Wall Street will be completely unaccountable, and above all, that the derivatives will be untouched. That's about 1.5 quadrillion to 2 quadrillion derivatives that are weighing down the U.S. banking system. This is why we have this prolonged stagnation and no recovery. And Obama is too weak, he's too devoted to the cause of serving Wall Street to be able to make a break with these bankrupt policies. But naturally, what Romney wants to do is in many ways to go back in grand style to the Bush-Cheney policies that created the bubble, union busting, tax cuts for the rich, and comprehensive deregulation. Romney would actually make a bad situation worse. And as the people from Occupy Wall Street, I would ask them, where's your presidential candidate? If you don't like Obama and Romney, most Americans would agree, where's your presidential candidate? I guess they never quite got around to thinking of that, did they?
Michael Preisner, why didn't they?
Why didn't they what? I didn't understand the question.
Why didn't they come up with a candidate, these Occupy movement protesters? That's been a big question, actually, since the start of the movement.
Right. Sure. Well, you know, the Occupy movement has made a very concerted effort to remain independent of the political establishment and to say that change isn't coming through the electoral process, it's not coming from the ballot box. Change is something that's going to happen in the streets through struggle. And that's something historically we know to be the case. And so the elections themselves is really a sham in democracy. I mean, to have any chance to become the president of the United States in this country, you must have the backing of the biggest banks, of the biggest corporations on Wall Street, and of the Pentagon. If you do not meet their litmus test, you have absolutely no chance of getting any attention or any headway in the election whatsoever. So the election system is rigged from the beginning. And while we get to vote on which president will occupy the White House, we don't get to vote on whether or not jobs are created. We don't get to vote on whether or not we go to war. We don't get to vote on whether or not the vast wealth of this society is used for health care or social services. So the only real democracy that we actually have in this country is the democracy that we exercise in the streets, with our feet, through protest, outside of these conventions, and everywhere else where we can find them.
Well, Webster Tarpley, you mentioned 35 million Americans that are unemployed. Figures of Americans on food stamp are hovering at around, 50 million people, of which the amount...
50 million.
Right, of which that amount has increased in the past 4 years that Obama has been in office. The staggering number in itself, is this going to get worse when we have, and I have to go back to this figure, of $5 trillion in just 3.5 years that Obama has spent? You don't consider that to be excessive spending? And then compare that, if you may, with what's going on with Americans who are on food stamps. Is it bad bookkeeping? Explain that to us, please.
The problem with the increase in the public debt is it's not being used for the right things. It has been used to bail out zombie banks, which is a hopeless task because those zombie banks are full of derivatives, and there is no way in the world you can bail out that mass of $1 to $2 quadrillion worth of derivatives.
What about the argument? I'm sorry to jump in.
You need a recovery program.
What about the argument that these banks who have been given stimulus money are sitting on top of cash for a variety of reasons, one of which has been for emergency uses?
Sure.
Of course, we don't know where that emergency is actually, the money is in liquidity form right now, sitting on top of these financial institutions, but money that's supposed to be pumped into the economy to give people credit, for example, whether it's for car loans, whether it's for homes, etc. Why isn't that happening? Who's to blame for that? Why is there money sitting? Isn't that part of the problem of this $16 trillion debt that it has amounted to at this point?
I would call that a capital strike. In other words, it's sabotage for economic and political reasons on the part of the Wall Street people themselves. And it's not the first time they've done that in American history. I would say that the heart of the matter is what you mentioned before. We have about 50 million people in the United States who are on the brink. They don't have a job. They might have had unemployment benefits, but those are gone. 99 weeks was the very most you could get, and after that, nothing. And of course, in most states, it's much less than 99 weeks. They don't have any health care. That's, again, about 50 million people. And there's no more welfare. If you had women with young children in the home, we used to have welfare from the Social Security Act of 1935. That was actually abolished by Bill Clinton in order to get himself reelected in 1996. So this is a bipartisan effort in favor of Wall Street and really to inflict, I call it, genocidal budget cuts on the American people. And right now, we have about 50 million people who live on food stamps. And food stamps in a place like New York City is about $180 a month, which comes to about, about $1.50 per meal, which is, you can't have good nutrition for that kind of money. The only difference between the Republicans and the Democrats in the Congress right now is the Democrats say cut the food stamp budget by $6 to $7 billion, and the Republicans say, no, that's not enough. We want more genocide. We want cuts of $30 to $35 billion. And I would have to say, I cannot justify the behavior of Occupy Wall Street. The strategy they seem to have is simply defeatism, that they're giving up on these points. You've got to get out there and fight, at least fight programmatically, do something against austerity, right? That we can't have any more austerity cuts. Austerity cuts don't work. We've seen it in Greece. You cut the budget this year, the deficit is bigger in the following year. The balanced budget is not a policy goal. That is crazy, especially in a depression. Again, that's what a Republican or a libertarian might argue. But we're headed towards a kind of an emergency here at the end of the year, where I think the Republicans, if they get control of the government, the presidency, the House, and the Senate, the Republican plan would be to cut the already depressed standard of living in the United States about minus 1/3 or minus 1/4, something along those lines. And again, that increases the death rate in the population quite markedly.
Well, let's talk about one of the things there with you, Mike Preisner, that Webster Tarpley talked about, and that's about the Republicans coming on. They've set $35 billion on November 2011. It was up to $70 billion, and of course that's about cuts, which I'd like to zoom in on and getting your impression on social services, Medicare, Medicaid, if they are cut. What is that going to do? I mean, we have millions of Americans who live on this assistance. And especially in depressed neighborhoods, whether from the major capitals, New York or LA or Chicago, you name it. Isn't that going to create and contribute to some type of civil unrest if these kinds of assistance get cut, if the Republicans come in office?
Oh, absolutely. But it's not just if the Republicans come into office. Like our other guest said, both Democrats and Republicans, in a bipartisan effort, have agreed that the burden of the economic crisis is going to be put on the most vulnerable sectors of society, on the poor, on working families, on the unemployed, on students who are in debt. And so every single person around the country right now, whether they're in a state with a Democratic governor or a Republican governor, at the state level, at the municipal level, everyone is seeing cuts to their schools, to their communities, to their social services. And, you know, economists like to talk about these cuts, and politicians like to talk about these cuts as if they're just numbers, right? As if, you know, so much is coming from here, so much is coming from here, and these are just kind of abstract statistics. But when you really see the human face of these things and the real human impact of the cuts that are happening, especially, you know, living here in a city like Los Angeles that's wrought with poverty and unemployment, when you're talking about cutting HIV and AIDS care, which, you know, thousands of patients are being cut all over the country. These are people who will die because of no other reason than the government said the funding is going to come from here so we don't have to tax the rich, or the funding is going to come from here so we don't have to cut the military budget and send less drones to go bomb poor people in Afghanistan and Yemen and Pakistan and Somalia. And so it's a conscious decision by the U.S. government to say that these people don't matter. Students in debt don't matter. The unemployed who are struggling to feed their families, who are living in their cars because they have no home, they don't matter. And we can take more and more from them as long as we're united in saying that the big banks, the corporations, the war machine will feel absolutely no burden whatsoever for this crisis. But not only that, we're going to take the money from those people who are suffering the most and give more money to those who created it and those who have the most money on the planet.
Webster Tarpley, I fail to understand when we talk about this huge figure that has amounted to $16 trillion, of which Obama has spent $5 trillion, how this can amount to this much money, given what Michael Preisner just said, taken away from the Americans. I mean, we're looking at this deficit as sucking the budget from American taxpayer dollars. And of course, Michael Preisner, you even mentioned about these wars, like the Afghanistan war, $300 to $400 million daily. And Obama is criticized by Romney for not taking a stronger pro-war stance, such as against Syria or such as against Iran. Now, Americans, Webster Tarpley, won't see a relief there from their money, will they, when it comes to these wars?
I think one of the untold stories of the Republican convention last week and the people around Romney is the Republicans don't say a word about foreign policy. I don't think there was very much about foreign policy at all in the Republicans. Maybe Condoleezza Rice, one speech. But the secret is that the Bush-era neocons, the people like Bolton and Elliot Cohen and Dan Senior and Robert Kagan, they're all back. And they're going to be in a Romney administration if you get it. In other words, the warmongers are waiting in the wings, and they've been very impatient with Obama. They say, Obama is not a big enough warmonger. We need more extreme aggressive policies. We need more adventurism, more hostility. They want to pick fights with Russia, with China, with Iran, as you say, with just about everybody in the world. So this is going on behind the scenes. But again, we've got to go beyond protest. Protest is necessary, but there's got to be something more, and that is called power and seizing power. If you can't seize all power, seize some of it and try to turn these things around. Just in terms of maintaining the social safety net, one of the things most people don't understand about the U.S. tax system is that Wall Street pays no tax, or virtually no tax. Most people here have to pay a sales tax. If you want to buy a pair of shoes or some consumer electronics, depending on the state you're in, you're going to pay between 6 and about 12% as sales tax. That's a regressive tax. But when Wall Street zombies and hyenas, when they do their high-frequency trading, flash trading, 1 million transactions per second, they don't pay anything on that. So a lot of people would say, why don't they pay a Wall Street sales tax? Make it 1%, give half to the federal government, half to the states, to maintain the social safety net, what we've been talking about, so that there will be unemployment benefits, there will be food stamps, because otherwise people are simply going to die. That is not a recovery, but it's absolutely essential because you've got to preserve your labor power. If you want to get a recovery, you got to go beyond that and seize control of the Federal Reserve and use that for cheap credit for production.
Well, Michael Preisner, our guest there, Webster Tarpley, talks about power. Now, we see power in the Occupy movement, but I'm going to turn this word power around. It appears, given some of the developments, that the American government is actually understanding and seeing and foreseeing, perhaps, what is going on. When we look at movements that have been made, such as the Department of Homeland Security purchasing millions of rounds of ammunition, such as some of these executive orders that have been signed, which monitor Americans, whether it's from their mobile phones or on the internet or their emails, et cetera, because they're seeing that what they're doing is indeed going to bring out a harsher, perhaps, reality, as we're seeing with the Occupy movements, and of course, for that to lead into perhaps some social disorder. Do you see that way? Do you see that as being a possibility?
Yes, of course. And we know the U.S. government is well aware of this, which is why, like you said, they were militarizing police forces around the country, infusing them with military equipment, riot gear, drones now being used in the United States. We're going to begin seeing that very soon. So the drones that are so hated overseas are not going to be patrolling skies over the United States. And the U.S. government is aware of this fact because they are aware of the reality in the United States. I think a very shocking statistic that many around the world may not realize that, in the United States, which is the richest country in human history, about 45% or 48% are in poverty technically by the U.S. government. So this is, half the population that's living under the official poverty line, and we know that many millions more are in actuality in poverty. And this is a contradiction that the system cannot resolve. I mean, these people who are in poverty because this is part of the natural tendency of the system we live under capitalism, under imperialism, where the only drive is to maximize profits here in the United States and around the world for a very small group of people. And that contradiction can only be resolved through struggle, through class struggle, because that's not something that's going to end, because that is caused, the hardship people are facing today is because this gap that is growing between the rich and the poor, where the one constant feature you see in the United States from its inception till today is the accumulation of wealth at the top. And so a small group of people becoming a smaller group and getting increasingly richer. And the accumulation of wealth at one pole means the accumulation of poverty and misery and hardship at the other pole. So no amount of reforms can change that fact. No amount of promises from a Democrat or Republican can change that fact. What we are seeing is a constant line of more and more people being disenfranchised and dispossessed, and a smaller group of people becoming richer and richer. And the only thing that can resolve that contradiction is a struggle between those two opposing forces, between the forces of the banks, of Wall Street, and the Pentagon, and the forces of the tens of millions, really hundreds of millions of people in the United States who work for a living, who create all the wealth of society, and then get nothing but crumbs from the table. So struggle is inevitable, and that's the only way any of these things are going to be resolved.
Okay, we're going to end it there. Thank you very much. We appreciate that. That's the Iraq War veteran Michael Preisner talking to us from Los Angeles. Also like to thank author and historian Webster Tarpley there from Washington. And thank you for watching another edition of the Press TV News Analysis. Any comments or suggestions, do send them. Newsroom@presstv.ir is our email address. From me, Tarpley, and the entire team here in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.